in terms of what we'll look at, we'll briefly introduce the learning crisis, which I think this room is already well aware of, talk a little bit about how we decided to approach the topic in terms of the theory and the method. I think there's multiple ways of researching the politics of learning outcomes, and ours is just one. It'd be good to have a conversation, given that we're so many people here from the research team, about how to move this forward. Key findings, which we break down between the national level and then the local and school level, before we come to implications for policy practice and future research in this field. And Naomi will finish off, but there'll be some to and fro in between that as well. So I'll hand over to Naomi now for first couple of slides on the learning crisis.
Okay, thank you. As Sam said, neither of us really are bona fide education experts, but I've done a little bit of work on this before this project. But I think here we felt a little bit uncertain about how much to discuss the learning crisis with people in this room who know a great deal better than we do the dimensions of this. I think really the one of the key things that we note in this discussion of the learning crisis is the difference between the political successes, if you like, of the expansion of mass education, as you can see in the graph on the left, the convergence of enrollment rates worldwide, contrasted with the diversity in learning outcomes across the world. So the really, really big differences that are, which one is this? Which are very, very, very evident. And the extent to which, in fact, the rapid expansion since the 80s and 90s has perhaps created the conditions in which education quality was either stagnant or, in some cases, worsened over time. But it is really striking. I think we sometimes forget how important this rapid mass expansion was and how surprising it was at the time. And yet it has not been accompanied by the kinds of gains in learning outcomes that we expected. There was an assumption that you'll get those bums on seats and all will be good, and it didn't happen. And in fact, the levels of attainment in many countries are absolutely low. This is not just a matter of relative low. There are whole systems. These are whole system failures where children will end primary school, will be midway through secondary school without having achieved basic primary level attainments. And I think there was a very striking figure in, it must have been in the WDR, which said, based on the PISA, the average student in a low-income country performs worse than 95% of students in OECD countries. That is, they would be in special needs classes. So if you go to school, any school, really, in most of the developing world, you will not get even a very, very basic level of education that you would get in OECD. So there's some really significant systemic issues to be addressed there. And it's true that poverty and the level of development do matter in the distribution of learning attainments, but it's not just that. We only have to look at Vietnam and some other countries that have done remarkably well for their level of income to know that it's not just about income levels. And as the World Bank reminds us in the WDR 2018, it's not just about money either. There's a lot of unevenness in spending. And spending is not very perfectly correlated with outcomes by any means. Having said that, education in most of the developing world, and we'll see this very clearly in our case study, tends to be under-resourced. And I think in particular, we noticed at the local level, or rather the subnational level, where monitoring tends to be very under-resourced. And yet when we look at the literature, the review of reviews by David Evans and colleagues recently, I think, showed that there isn't much agreement, actually, about what works to improve learning. The most important statements, really, of the politics of education in the development policy space have been the WDR 2004, which brought forward this idea of accountability through the short route and the long route, as an explanation of what did or did not work to improve education services. And in the last year's WDR, in fact it's now 2017, isn't it? They came up with the idea that policies were misaligned. So you had these goals of learning attainments, but you had these policies which were aligned to building schools and recruiting teachers and so on. But what was not clear was why. What were the political factors behind this misalignment? So we feel that this book kind of jumps off where the WDR ends in a way. I'm doing this one, aren't I? Yes. So it is really interesting, in fact, that there isn't much literature on the politics of education. I think probably everyone in this room knows this. There's been relatively little over the years, and in fact, even though much of what there is focused on the developed world, there isn't very much of that either. I mean, political scientists say, among other things, it has to do with the fact that education decisions really, at the end, get made in households, and political scientists find it impossible to get into households and household decision making. We don't do that either in this book. We're not getting into the household either, but we are bringing a political analysis to the problem of education. That literature that is there on the politics of education is very much about issues of access, not about issues of quality, with some notable exceptions, which we do discuss in the book. But there are some useful and important pieces of work, and they show, among other things, that it is really the informal politics that matter. You know, you can correlate democracy with public spending on education all you like, but that's not going to tell you how coalitions that actually advance policy reforms get made, and the kinds of policy champions and entrepreneurs that have made changes in the work of Steve Kosak, among others. I think, yes, also in relation to local governance, the way in which local coalitions and local politics make a difference. We do know a little bit more about this now. And yet the literature still is under-theorized and empirically, I guess, under-specified. So I'm handing to Sam.
Yep, so our main question was, how do political and political economy factors shape elite's commitment to higher quality education? And it's worth being very specific about this, because we are not trying to explain learning outcomes themselves via a political analysis. We don't think the data is available for that. What we wanted to look at is whether or not elites were committed to higher quality education, as indicated through rolling out reforms that were could be reasonably expected to lead to better learning and not just schooling over a sustained period. So that was our focus. In terms of how we went to look at that, we agreed with Lant Pritchett's and others. I mean, Lant's manifesto for the RISE programme talks about the ingredients of what a political economy approach to explaining learning outcomes should look like, and he rejects big indicators such as GDP or democracy as being very useful. And we concur with that, and we're trying to go for something a bit more fine-grained that gets to the informal as well as the formal politics of how learning outcomes are shaped, or elite commitment to learning outcomes are shaped. So the big concept here is the political settlement, which Difford has invested lots of time and energy researching, refining as a conceptual approach, and really tries to get beyond institutions themselves to the forms of politics and power relations that underpin them and shapes how they actually perform in practice. This means looking at the holding power of different social groups within society and how those groups relate to the most powerful group in society, the governing or ruling coalition. There's a sense in which the arrangement of power relations in relation to the ruling coalition shapes its time horizons, shapes its incentives to respond to particular development objectives and not others. It's a concept which draws attention to the role of elite incentives, but particularly in terms of what elites need to do to maintain themselves in power. But we've challenged that the idea that political elites only respond to incentives. We think ideas are also significant in determining elite behaviour and can't just be read off from electoral incentives, for example. Our second main concept is of the policy domain. So we didn't think that we could move straight from an analysis of politics straight to elite commitment of learning outcomes or any other of the policy issues we've looked at in ESID. Different domains have got their own logics and politics to them. And within that, we wanted to look at how political settlement shaped the education policy domain, which means asking a series of questions around, for example, the political role that education plays. What does it do in terms of offering legitimacy to ruling coalitions? Does it offer a source of rents to ruling coalitions to maintain themselves in power and other cumulative strategies? What are the range of ideas, policy ideas and actors that are active in the sphere, and what's their holding power in relation to the ruling coalition? Do they form around distinctive policy coalitions that contest different policy agendas within, in this case, the education space? Third question around governance arrangements. How are goods and services delivered in this domain? Issues of centralised, localised performance management, accountability mechanisms, for example. And finally, issues of what types of policy challenge are underway. We distinguish, using Lamb, Pritchett and others' work, between logistical policy challenges and transactional policy challenges. So building a school and employing a teacher is a fairly logistical challenge, not that difficult to do. Making sure teachers turn up and teach is a much more difficult challenge, a transactional challenge. So we argue that the political settlement does the heavy lifting, influences the policy domain in particular ways which shape elite commitments and state capacity to deliver on various outcomes. We wanted to go a bit further than that. We didn't want to just say it's all about politics. We wanted to specify how politics matters, and we've identified, using Brian Levy's work, different types of political settlements. And this diagram shows two different dimensions of political settlements. There are other varieties of these typologies around. On the vertical axis, it looks at the configuration of political power, the extent to which ruling coalitions there's a concentration of power around ruling coalitions, higher towards the top, lower towards the bottom. This matters in terms of the extent to which ruling coalitions feel confident that they're going to be in power over a prolonged period, which can lead to longer term investments in institution building, for example, sometimes protection of technocrats, giving them space to work. Versus settings within which ruling coalitions face at least a 4 to 5 year challenge to their stay in power, and a strong chance that they will be overturned. Now, the initial thinking behind this was around industrial policy and growth, and a sense in which this would lead to highly fractured, fragmentary policies, which make it difficult for governments to undertake difficult reforms in that space. When you move this concept across to social provisioning, that becomes a bit more complicated. You might think that having a more competitive political system is going to drive, from the bottom up, more pressures to perform. So we saw this as a test of the framework by taking it into the educational realm. Across the horizontal axis, we looked at the bureaucracy, the extent to which public institutions operate along either personalised or impersonalised lines. Can people expect, when they counter institutions, to be treated as clients or citizens, would be one way of understanding the range here. And there's obvious links between the two axes. So there's a presumption, according to Mushtaq Khan's work, that dominant settlements can have a long time frame, may invest in building impersonal organisations over a long time. We also know that kleptocratic states can highly personalise and capture institutions as well. So it's by no means sure that will happen. In competitive contexts, some people argue that popular pressure will drive up accountability towards citizenship-based approaches. Others point out that where you've got low levels of bureaucratic capacity in the first place, if you overlay that with high levels of political competition, that raises the incentives for elites to use public institutions in a way to maintain political power and loyalty, rather than delivering goods as of right to groups. So again, there's different hypotheses for how these will actually play out in practice that we wanted to test. How do we do this? So obviously we chose our cases to fit different political settlements types, so we could have some more systematic comparative analysis that have been lacking in the field. We adopted a multi-leveled approach where we went all the way from the national through local government right down to school level governance. We hadn't really seen that done elsewhere, so we thought that would be quite useful to see how politics ran all the way from the centre to the local area, while being aware that working in low to low middle income countries means that transnational influence would also be significant. To try, without pretending to have been RCT rigorous about this, we did look for paired comparisons at the local level between, say, high performing and low performing provinces, districts and schools. So we chose, for example, at the local level, an urban district and a rural district. Within the urban, we chose a high-performing school and a low-performing school, where everything else was pretty much constant in terms of socioeconomic background, local governance context, to look really at school-level governance issues. We did that in most of the cases and try and look at the role of politics in governance. In terms of what aspects of educational quality we focused on, as Naomi pointed out, there isn't a great deal of clarity on this. It's difficult to identify. Okay, we know that if elites are trying to do this, they must be committed, and learning outcomes will follow from this. The evidence didn't really tell us what to look at beyond about 6 or 7 things, of which we chose 2. So we chose to look at teacher training and local accountability mechanisms, the quality of the teaching staff, which WGR 2018 came down strongly, and accountability mechanisms with a view to looking at the extent to which teachers were on task and in work. Just to take us into what the countries look like in terms of learning outcomes, before we get to some of our findings, Naomi's going to talk a little bit about where our 6 countries are up to, which I haven't named, they were up there, but you can perhaps...
Yes, and I think probably everyone in this room will be aware that these countries have had quite distinctively different education trajectories in some ways, and yet there is, as I said earlier, this convergence within these countries as well. It is quite remarkable how we've all been moving towards this 100% eventually, one hopes, net enrollment ratio, but all children more or less in each of these countries getting a chance to go to school of some kind of quality, to go and sit in a school anyway, let's say, to enroll. And so that's quite important. When you look at the indicators of quality that are comparable across these countries, though the picture's a little bit more mixed. So on the left, we've got the primary completion rate. This has been a real concern in a lot of countries where dropout is high and repetition is high. The efficiency of the system is quite important, in particular for for moving up into the next level, into secondary and higher secondary. So a great deal of variation there still. Rwanda, being the star social development performer performs surprisingly poorly, perhaps, on all of this and on all of these indicators. Although I do understand that there are some debates about the extent to which pupil-teacher ratios actually matter. I mean, if your teacher's showing up but doesn't herself read or write very well, then maybe it doesn't make a great deal of difference. But it is a fairly standard indicator of the quality of the inputs, at least, going in there. We should perhaps have summarised the cases a little bit here, and I wish we had. Anyway, we didn't. But we will talk about some of the findings at the national, at the subnational, and at the school level. But we should say they are distinctively different cases in many different ways. We have middle-income countries, we have really quite low-income countries. And we've had countries where, for instance, Cambodia, where the transition has been extremely rapid, and countries like South Africa, where relatively high levels of enrolment have persisted for a very long time, with actually surprisingly poor education attainment levels. Looking again at Brian Levy and Co.'s chapter in the book, it is striking how poorly South Africa does for its level of income. Kenya outperforms it by some way and has a GDP per capita of 1/5 of South Africa. So there's some real puzzles there. I think we'll move to the next one.
Yeah. So
you have to explain this.
Yeah. This is, so I mean, just to mention the cases then. So we chose 2 cases that were competitive, clientelistic in Brian Levy's terms, Bangladesh and Ghana. So highly competitive, a strong chance of electoral turnovers during the period we were looking at least. Bangladesh is challenging that very strongly now, but fairly personalised forms of public bureaucracies. We had Rwanda and Uganda as more dominant countries, but still highly personalised, and also Cambodia fits into this category, so 3 countries in the dominant personalised category. And then South Africa, fairly dominant in terms of at least ANC's share of the vote, even though it's a big, broad church itself. And much more institutionalised, given the more prolonged period of state building that's taken place in South Africa compared to our other countries. So this table here is an attempt to impute some sort of evaluation and measure of elite commitment to educational quality in each of the countries. We were challenged to do this when submitting some of this work for publication, not the particular OUP book, but a shorter version of this. And I kind of wish we hadn't been, or that we'd done it a lot earlier, I think. I think it's worth doing. So if you think of other attempts to measure elite commitments, the Hunger and Nutrition Index, HANSI, that Naomi's colleagues have done has actually been quite useful for putting a spotlight on which countries are taking certain issues seriously. And I think this might play a similar role. We just haven't got the indicators as right as we should have done here. So we've looked at government priority to quality reforms, the degree of policy coherence in the sector, and the degree of technocratic leadership. There's lots of other things we could have looked at. Has a country got a strong national assessment system in place? What's the emphasis on teacher training like? The legal status of reforms, budgets around teachers. Lots of things could go into a more useful index. So we're very hesitant to present this. Naomi told me I should take it out on the basis of it being spurious empiricism. I thought it'd be good to show that there's potential here, even if we haven't made good on it. So when we looked at how the priority given to quality reforms, we looked at the whether or not reforms were there that did place a significant emphasis on quality as opposed to just access, whether political leaders talked about these on a regular basis, or whether they formed a meaningful point of political debate and a touchstone within countries. Around policy coherence, we looked at whether or not the policies were sustained in practice, whether they were overridden by other policy announcements during the same cycle, which may have contradicted those gains. For example, we found this very strongly to be the case in Uganda, which announced quite a few reforms in the 2000s around quality, but then moved into universal secondary education, which swallowed up nearly all the sources for that. And technocratic leadership of education, to what extent ministerial, permanent secretary and other appointments were made with a view to technocratic leadership of the sector as opposed to putting political place people in place and party cadres and so on. And the aggregate score, we checked all of this with our country experts, so it's highly qualitative judgments being made here. But it's interesting that our competitive, one thing that came out is that none of them are performing particularly well here. There's no high performers. That the weakest performers are your dominant personalised ones, Rwanda and Uganda. Slight improvement towards your competitive ones. And things get a little bit better with South Africa and Cambodia. And so we will try and explain some of this variation in the next couple of slides. So the big news is that none perform very well. And the biggest answer we had to this is really around the coalitions. We found in a very sustained way that every country had strong coalitions, social groups with holding power that had a shared interest in access to education, being much more powerful than those which had an interest in learning outcomes and equality. So if you think of populist leaders reliant on rural constituencies to maintain themselves in power, with the support of donor financing, and teachers' unions which benefited from the increase in employment rates, all of these far outweigh the types of coalitions you would expect to see in favour of learning outcomes. So unions would be a good example of that. Lots to gain by expansion of the workforce, of schools, and so on. Hardly anything to be gained in an interest-based way, at least, by efforts to improve learning outcomes. Donors have only recently come to thinking very hard about quality and learning outcomes. And the types of actors that you would expect to see pushing for upgrading, such as businesses and middle-class parents, are notably absent. So this is partly relates to the level of structural transformation in these economies. You don't have business groups which require very high levels of human capital to deliver on their comparative advantages. Even where countries have become fairly well integrated in the global economy, Bangladesh around garments, for example, there's not a huge demand for higher quality human capital there. So you don't see business groups lobbying around this. They lobby around plenty of other things, but not this. Middle-class parents, typically associated through PTAs and other mechanisms, have to, not a full but a large extent, exited the public sector in these countries. Because partly related to the access agenda, they perceive the public sector to be poorly performing and now send their kids to private schools, more so than kids from poorer backgrounds. That was a big finding, and not only is this creates very uneven incentives. There's no strong incentive for ruling coalitions to emphasise learning outcomes. The pressures for access can in some ways undermine drives towards learning outcomes. For example, populist promises for free education, despite that not never been the case in any of these countries, can undermine the search for alternative financing arrangements which are required to drive up better learning outcomes. The second big finding was that education systems, as I think is alluded to in WGR 2018, are not primarily geared towards learning. They serve a whole range of other political purposes. They offer rent-seeking opportunities, procurement opportunities through building schools, even distributing textbooks, huge patronage opportunities through the distribution of jobs. You see a big turnover of jobs in Ghana, for example, either side of elections, depending on which party. All the way through the system, from the top of the education system down to teaching staff at local levels as a result of elections. The emphasis on access is there through schools, highly visible public goods that politicians can get political capital for. You don't get the payoffs through learning outcomes. But also around ideas, strong pressure to use the education system to promote particular types of ideas. Bangladesh is the best example here. In the conditions of growing influence of Islamic thinking within the political space as well, and highly partisan and closely contested elections, there's strong incentives to use the public education system for partisan purposes, telling particular types of histories of Bangladesh's development that suit one party rather than the other. So education systems are geared towards other things. I mean, the Bangladeshi case in terms of access versus outcome, it's striking how the percentage of GDP per capita allocated towards education falls off in the 2000s once access is attained. Elite interest falls away from the tougher challenge of learning outcomes. We did find fairly similar levels of commitment in Bangladesh and Ghana, and a bit better than the dominant personal cases of Rwanda and Uganda. We're not precisely sure why this is. There's two mechanisms which might work, one of which again is around ideas. You find a strong level of elite commitment to the idea of education amongst political elites in both Bangladesh and Ghana for various reasons, linked back to late colonial issues in Ghana around colonial and missionary movements. Naomi can talk about that Bangladeshi case in more depth around this idea and belief in modernity and a desire to create a modern citizenry in Bangladesh is still resonant. There is a sort of de facto level of accountability you get from having more open political systems, even if it's not in a very coherent way. And the elites are more accountable for what they do around public services in these countries, and that may be one of the mechanisms at work here. But you also find all the problems you would expect in competitive clientelistic cases. High degree of policy incoherence. Ghana is a good example of this. You have technocrats being given space to work on an education sector strategic plan, and then election changes, the president comes in with a whole new task force and overrides these and puts in place a new set of priorities. You have very little space for bureaucrats to manoeuvre from national right down to local levels, as we'll go on to discuss. Having open political spaces actually gives unions lots of space, and other people, Mo and Weiberg, have argued that this is a very bad thing for learning outcomes. We don't join the union bashing actually in our book. We didn't find compelling evidence that unions were the biggest obstacle to driving up learning outcomes. We looked for it, but we found as much evidence in Ghana that unions and importantly teachers' associations, professional associations, were taking learning outcomes seriously and trying to push for quality reforms, as we did for them blocking reforms. We didn't find the types of evidence that you find from India, where some people, I think with some ideological priors, have really identified unions as the key problem here. We didn't really identify that. In our more dominant personalised cases, we find, and what's interesting is that failure occurs in different ways. So the way in which failure occurs in the competitive context is somewhat different to the way in which failure occurs in dominant personalised cases. In Rwanda, which as Naomi pointed out, it's been a star performer in lots of other social indicators, particularly health, maternal mortality and so on. Does incredibly badly compared to other countries, similar income and so on, around learning outcomes. And we trace a big part of this, or Tim Williams does in the book and other articles, to a couple of things. Primarily the decision in 2009 or 2008, rolled out in 2009, to shift the language of instruction from French to English. This occurs within the middle of a 2008 to 2012 strategic plan, which technocrats have worked very hard on, is unannounced previously, and takes place before there's any analysis of whether or not the teaching staff is capable of doing this. And on further analysis, only 14% of the teaching staff is capable of giving instruction in English. but it fits with the President's ideas around transforming Rwanda into a modern country, and is imposed without having the capacity to actually deliver it. Interestingly, Kagame also introduces other measures around access around the same time, the extension from 9 to 12 years, at election time, which is unusual actually. It implies that education might be even more politicised than other realms which are taken a bit more technocratically. Our final hypothesis would be that if Rwanda does start to take this seriously, it may start to move very quickly, as we've seen with other reforms, but it still engages in a very hierarchical form of performance management, which may not be suitable to the transactional task of delivering on learning outcomes at local level, where you require more bottom-up and horizontal flows of information to make sure that teachers are on task, for example. Also, education officials in Rwanda are heavily involved in doing the heavy lifting of monitoring other sectors. They spend more time monitoring other sectors than monitoring their own because of the ecosystem and so on. So Rwanda's drive towards performance is actually not very good for the education sector in particular. Uganda is a very different type of dominance, and the problems caused by personalised populism, which has been the characteristic of Museveni's politics since the early 2000s. The 1996 promise for free universal primary education has closed down any discussion, or nearly any discussion at national through to local level, of alternative financing arrangements required. It also was a move that was put in place to undermine middle class control of this sector. It undermined the process through which PTAs could oversee schools in favour of head teachers more easily controlled within the sector. There's a number of problems with the access reforms that were introduced in Uganda. We don't see a strong push towards working through institutions in terms of delivery of public goods over the last 10 years, and neither do we find competitive pressures. The last elections were pretty competitive in 2016. That hasn't put more pressure for quality in Uganda. It led to actually, interestingly, the appointment of the First Lady, the President's wife, as the Minister of Education, which has had no meaningful impact on quality. Has been quite good for the Christian Modi, though. Cambodia, elections have taken a different turn. There it seems to have been pushed the Prime Minister towards a more technocratic focus, the appointment of a minister who is keen to promote technocratic reforms within the sector, as happened in the health sector. And we hypothesise, but we haven't really fully evidenced, the sense in which Cambodia's closer integration into various global value chains, which do require a higher capital workforce, may starting to be feeding through into the sector as well. I won't speak at length about South Africa. There's a whole book on that. Just to point out that having a higher quality bureaucracy clearly does matter. Particularly the Western Cape versus the Eastern Cape comes out very strongly on that. And the cases that Brian talks to really highlight the need to reduce the political settlements analysis down to a more local level, and that it can be operationalised within quasi or fully federal systems at state level and provincial level, and further down, as we'll see with the Ghana case, at district level, to look at the interplay between the incentives that political elites face and how that interfaces with the bureaucratic system, and the ways in which that undermined progress in the Eastern Cape, and also through hierarchical approaches rather than more multi-stakeholder approaches, meant that Western Cape performs well within the context of South Africa, but very poorly in relation to elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. So we need to get down a bit more to the district level here, so I'll hand over to Naomi for that.
Yes, thanks. And so, as Sam said, the methodology of this study was to try to trace the effects of political settlements, or the balance of power, essentially at the national level, and the politics of the policy domain, right through from the national level, right through down to the subnational, district, or provincial, and then down to the school level, to see what the implications were, how these played out in different places. So it is interesting that across these countries, within these countries, there's really quite a lot of variation in performance. Surprising, I mean, within a range of between not good and a little bit less not good, but still, a huge amount of variation, really. And it seems regardless of whether the system was very centralised or decentralised, this variation exists. And one of the things that we think was very interesting, and I think this comes out most clearly in the Ghana case study, is that you do have local level political coalitions forming in places where the administration of education has been decentralized, and you have situations where the politics is very competitive and there's a lot of inter and intra-party conflict going on. It becomes less possible for political elites to form around, make a developmental coalition that really supports policy reforms. By contrast, in the Ghana case, we found where there was a greater alignment between the politics and the administration, where the politics was not so divisive, where the MP wasn't competing with the district officials for power and authority. They were able to drive through some of the reforms and also to innovate around local level solutions to problems. In general, we found that there is a kind of an issue between the centre and the local and how these were aligned. We found there's a lot of evidence that you have quite high degrees of centralisation, where teacher recruitment, teacher training is all set from the centre, and then without effective monitoring of what teachers are actually doing in classrooms, this leaves quite a lot of school level discretion, which I'll look at in the next slide. But as I say, local politics and governance did have impacts. The Ghana case was the most important one. I'm trying to think now, what was the other one to talk about? We did see in all of the cases that what we did was select the better performing and the less well performing regions and schools within each of those. Sorry, I've lost my thread there.
I'm sure you're thinking of.
I'm trying to think now. Sorry, I think I was going to say about South Africa, in fact. So South Africa shows very clearly, in fact, how you have two provinces with very, very different overall outcomes, and how you have a strong bureaucratic system in the Western Cape and a far weaker one, and yet the politics in each varying very greatly. So you have much more competitive politics, much more diversity in the Eastern Cape. In the Western Cape, and a much more strong ANC hold on the politics of the Eastern Cape, not pushing therefore for any kind of improvements in quality outcomes. I don't know what I was trying to say with policy information.
I think basically in all of the systems we find no central systemic pressure to increase learning outcomes. Which means that implementation around this is highly discretionary at local levels. Yeah. So there's no system.
But not. I think the critical point is not entirely, like, context is not everything here. But the way in which the politics is set out in the national political settlement does have an impact at the subnational level, and therefore at the local level. And I think the Ghana case shows this very well. But other cases also show how this works out. We also trace these outcomes down to the community level, to the school level, and there again we see that politics do play out at the local level, where you have a political coalition at the subnational and the community level that is committed to, is coming together to drive up standards, in particular to monitor teachers and to make sure teachers show up and perform. You have these. I don't know why. I don't remember writing that sentence, so it must have been.
Which one?
Sorry,
that's the point about the coalitions, political stakeholders. I think we found it particularly in Ghana, but also in Uganda.
So what you have is. What we found is that you have you have schools which perform relatively well. In all of these settings, you can identify schools that perform relatively well. And in those relatively well-performing schools, you find that policies to drive up quality, to ensure teachers perform, teachers show up, they are implemented. But where you don't have good performing schools, the policy reforms are basically implemented or not implemented. The really critical thing is when you have a coalition between communities and SMC, school managing committees, or PTAs. And these tend to come about under conditions where local politics creates the possibilities, but also where you have certain social and administrative conditions that work. So you can have schools that are able to implement quality reforms in both rural and urban settings, in places where you would expect schools to perform well, but also in places where you wouldn't expect a school to perform so well. Really critical thing here is school management and governance. I think it's a well-known thing in the education literature that head teacher leadership makes a huge difference, and this is true again. But we don't want to just devolve all of this onto head teachers and what they do as the answer to school quality reforms. It makes a great deal of difference how the head teacher is enabled to drive through these reforms at the local level or not. We find a lot of cases, and I think this is true both in the decentralized cases and in the more centralized cases, such as Bangladesh and Cambodia, that you do have quite innovative solutions to school financing where the rules do not permit. In Uganda, where explicitly parents are prevented from making contributions to school, you do instead, they do have local workarounds against this law that make it possible for for parents to contribute. And in fact, it's in the schools where parents are contributing, which is indicating greater participation of parents, that you're actually getting better outcomes. Overall, though, the ways in which teachers are managed at the local level involves a great deal more positive incentives and far fewer negative incentives. Teachers are very rarely held to account in any formal way. There are a lot of, how do we put this, innovations and clever workarounds for getting teachers to perform. I think than more formal systems. Teachers are never fired. Or even evaluated, that's right. We also see, though, that where you have a really constructive kind of developmental coalition around school performance and school management, there you get better oversight from the local administration. Local education authorities are classically very under-resourced and have very little oversight capacity, and so where there are head teachers that are keen to get teachers to show up and perform, that's where monitoring tends to be better. So it's a kind of a mutually supportive arrangement there. And I think that's probably enough to say about that. You want to? Is it? We need to.
11, you're close.
Okay, we better wrap.
Okay, very briefly in summary then. Do you want to do this one?
No, you can do it.
Okay, so very clear that education is a highly politicised domain within the countries we've looked at. Coalitions are heavily against learning outcomes and much more in support of access. This isn't just about incentives. Paradigmatic elite ideas really matter here, and the policy legacies that have led to endure and complicate the ground for promoting learning outcomes. Different types of settlements do matter. They shape failure in different ways. They can also shape success in different ways. We do find evidence of more de facto accountability and room for manoeuvre, national to local, within competitive settlements. Dominant settlements, if you look at the work that Lam Pritchett's been doing recently, he identifies the fastest improvers over time as being those that fall into the dominant category, China, Vietnam, Singapore, etc. But we want to see more research on that to see whether that's going to hold. What are the mechanisms which enable that? Because we're not convinced how that feeds through into the transactional challenges, which may not suit dominant areas. Implications for policy. Before you even get to smart policies and reforms and school level incentives and so on, I think the key thing is the need to build stronger coalitions that are capable of demanding quality education. Shifting the balance of power within the domain of education in these countries is critical. It means working with business, with teachers' associations, maybe not unions, donors coordinating much more coherently around this and trying to tap into middle class associations within developing countries. There's lots of work that IFID and others have done around coalition building which can be brought to bear here. Making sure interventions fit with particular contexts is really significant. There's no off-the-shelf reforms that are going to work everywhere, but we do think different types of settlements open themselves up to different types of reforms. We can come back to that if you like. Governance arrangements do need to be much better aligned, particularly via central local performance management arrangements. And we have identified a whole range of local level solutions that could potentially carefully be rolled out, if not fully scaled up. None of this gets away from the fact that these systems are very poorly resourced. There's a huge financing gap. We think we're only scratching the surface here in terms of the research that needs to be done to give a clearer picture of the politics of learning outcomes. We need much better comparable data. WDR's got a whole chapter on how to think about that and do that, which we concur with. We're interested in maybe going further with the elite commitment to learning index as an accountability mechanism as much as a research tool. And we think there's much more scope for making this type of work more systematic in relation to a clearer picture of outcomes, working out which types of reform work well in which types of context, and getting away from the politics of reform to the politics of implementation, as Merrill's closing chapter of the book makes clear, is the biggest single challenge. So anyway, we look forward to hearing what our expert discussions and the rest of you have to say about this and where to push things.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I will invite Rachel to discuss it, and Rachel will have to go soon as she has other commitments.
Well, now this one's working. Okay, great. So I found this really interesting as someone who's tried to push for reform in education on quality. I completely agree that politics is really important. So I found it fascinating to have someone thinking about that in a kind of more structured way. And I was particularly struck by, which in a sense was, I don't want to say obvious, but kind of as soon as you said it was, yes, of course, but I hadn't really thought of it in this way, the difference between the politics of increasing access versus learning and how different those are. So we often talk, we always talk about the improvements in learning versus the improvement of access, but we don't always think through kind of the politics of those two things are very different. I thought I particularly looked at the Rwanda and Bangladesh case, and I think, the Rwanda language case is just such a classic example of kind of, everyone says, when I was working at JPAL, they're like, go to Rwanda, you convince one person and they'll roll it out throughout the country. It's, the easiest place to work in that way, but it comes with that kind of political system, comes with a downside, and I think this is just a brilliant example of that downside. I mean, the switch to English when nobody knew how to speak English is just a brilliant example of the downside of that kind of politics, and how it can go wrong. So people may dispute this. I also think that they sometimes have an issue. I found in working, in discussing reform with, in Rwanda, particularly education reforms, there was at some point an unwillingness to admit they had a problem, which can also be one of the things that goes along with that kind of politics. Right? So, it's just really extraordinary to look at how brilliantly they do on health versus education. And we ended up not working with them because they said they don't have a problem. We're like, fine, we'll go work with Zambia, who thinks they do have a problem. So that's one bit I would add to it. The increase in access in Bangladesh immediately after the independence is just, extraordinary and really interesting. And I think you've got a nice rationale for why that happens. I think it also, I was very struck. Ted Miguel had this in his book on Africa a few years ago, is tracking how, with the increase in democracy across sub-Saharan Africa, you see free education. Like, it's a very quick win for a politician to do. So you talk about increase in access. I haven't read the whole book, but I think this free education is a really, quick thing that people can offer. And he does a nice job of sort of tracking the correlation between those two things. So I think that's great. I think sort of really insightful. agree about, the building the schools and stuff. I guess I would put there are a couple of areas where I would put a different nuance, or, maybe coming from an economics background, my immediate analysis of, why access versus quality would be different is that one is observable and one is not. Particularly when you have an illiterate population. So I've done some work looking at whether when you increase quality in schools, you see the public responding. So it ought to be that parents would send their schools, they would focus more on sending their kids to school, getting them to turn up more once quality improves. And we've got all these RCTs that increase quality so you can see whether you get a response. And it's pretty mixed. Basically, people don't respond very much when you increase quality, and that's probably because they don't understand that the inequality is it. They can't observe the increase in quality. So it's very hard as a politician to say, I'm increasing quality, I'm putting lots of money into it, and people can't see that it's increased. So we also have data from India that tests whether people know the quality of the school. Do they know what their kids have learned? And the answer is no, they don't. So when Pratham went in to try and build a political movement to push for increased quality, one of the biggest the only thing that Pratham has ever tried to do that has failed was that, right? And we have a paper on it. And our argument is that that's because they spent ages going in and trying to raise awareness of quality. And I was in a lot of those focus groups. The only thing people would say back is, yes, but my kid isn't getting the free school meals. And they're like, no, quality, Shawarrior, is your kid learning? Let's test your kid. They saw that the kid wasn't learning. Yes, but what about free?
Yeah.
And they completely failed to raise education quality in their local education discussion. So I think that might be, that's an interesting thing to look at. So I think it's also relevant to talk about the power of teachers versus the people in the local population. And it frustrates me in the discussions about education that are global. People assume that teachers are low power, and actually in poor communities, they're the most educated, richest person in the community. They have a lot of power. In a rural Indian village, they're the high-class person. And so there's that local politics, I think, which meant that, despite all Pratham's work, no one was willing to stand up to the local teacher. So one other thing I would slightly disagree with is that we don't know how to improve quality. So I know that Dave Evans' paper. I disagree. I mean, I think he overstates that. I think what it really shows is people put different projects into different categories. Anyway, that's a longer story, but I think there is much more consensus. And one of the things that there's a lot of consensus on is that one of the big reasons quality isn't improving is because the system is designed to deliver for the elite and not for the rest, which kind of fits into what you're saying, but I think it's quite important in this politics. So again, I haven't read all your book, I don't know whether you talk about this, but basically the exams are only, 2% or 5% in Sierra Leone in some years, 0%, but a very, very small number of people pass the exam. So it's really an exam that's designed for determining whether you go into university. It's irrelevant to most of the population. The curriculum is then based around the exam. The curriculum's completely focused on the top 5% of the population. So you said middle-class parents, that if the main reform is stop teaching to the top of the class, start teaching to the average, you're not going to get the middle-class parents supporting that, right? Or the elite supporting that, because it's going to potentially make their kids worse off. So that's the most consensus around how to improve quality, but there are real losers potentially in the system. So I think the politics of that is really hairy. And you focus more on teacher absenteeism, which is really hard, but I think the more interesting questions is why aren't countries doing the things that don't involve taking on their teachers? Right, there are a lot of wins out there that you can do that aren't opposition to teachers. And I think, you know, like this changing the curriculum. And so I think, I guess I'd encourage you to think about those reforms. The teacher absenteeism and taking on the teachers is part of education reform, and it's the part that Lang's really into, and about accountability. But I think actually there are a lot of researchers who think there's a lot of interesting space that is not about taking on teachers.
Okay.
You can disagree with me.
Great.
I have to say, if you're interested in something on the politics of learning versus the politics of access, I just want to say this is a hugely important book. I mean, it's really, to me, the most serious and comprehensive and fascinating thing yet written on the subject. And I think it's must reading for anyone interested in education and anyone who works in education, whether or not they think they're interested in education reform, because they have to be interested in the politics to do their job. So I want to talk about three things. First, what I think is so wonderful about what you did. Second, a couple of nuggets from the book that I think are you know, to me, really show the value of doing this kind of in-depth case studies. And third, then, what I want to see in your next book. I'd like to see in your next book. I mean, what you did, I think, it's a lesson to all of us. First, you know, you did a great review of the existing literature, everything that's written on the subject. Second, you really brought a lot of the political science thinking. I didn't realize you were political scientists rather than education people, but it's so obvious that you brought that political science thinking and constructs to the education community. Third, you developed clear and interesting hypotheses. Fourth, you tested those hypotheses with these series of case studies across, you know, 6 fairly different, some diversity, just 2 regions. I would say it'd be nice to have something on Latin America, but and then you rigorously reported the results of those case studies, even when the results didn't really line up very well with your hypotheses. And then finally, you asked 2 other big thinkers in the subject in this area to write chapters, knowing that they each have their own frameworks, and you asked them to critique yours. I think it's phenomenal. I mean, if everyone worked the way you guys have, our knowledge, I think our research base would be a lot richer. So on some of the nuggets, I think from my standpoint, it's very interesting that there's clear evidence in the case studies that decentralization as a mantra doesn't work. You know, the diversity of outcomes you see, you know, all of these countries actually have had school-level management committees and, you know, have some slightly more or less degree, but pretty consistently they've all taken this policy stance of moving resources and decision-making down to lower levels of government. And you see these wildly different outcomes, like, you know, and even using the settlements framework, you see some cases where the school headmaster has good ties with the local community and then uses that to get things done, get better teachers assigned to the school, and other cases where the headmaster uses it to make sure that they don't question her absenteeism, that you can, you know, that they tolerate her absenteeism. So and one image that, I hope someone's heard me. And one image that really stuck in my mind was the Rwanda parents, where they sit through the school committee meetings and don't say a word, don't feel empowered to open their mouths. And as Rachel said, and that's been documented before, that there's this often a power imbalance at the local level, particularly in poor countries, and particularly in rural areas, where the only educated person in the community is the teacher, and they have a status that no one else really feels they can challenge. That I don't say don't decentralize by no means, but really give attention to making sure that you can find a way to make it workable, to make it meaningful. And so my last point is really for the future. there's some, I think, important transversal issues in the book that I think came out much better in your summary now than in the book itself. Like one is the role of individual, like reform, what Mary Lee Grindle called reform mongers, these charismatic people that, you know, can really take charge and lead, you know, conceptualize and lead a reform. And you have the story of Dr. Naron in Cambodia, and you have some of the headmasters at the school level in Western Cape and stuff. And that conjured that role to me. And I think it's interesting to put in your framework, these are people that not only technically understand what needs to be done, but they have the political savvy to find what Mary Lee Grindle calls room for maneuver, expand the room for maneuver. I guess in your situation, you'd say to build a coalition around the political settlement that would allow it to be used for developmental progress. And the second idea from Mary Lee is the role of ideas, which you mentioned very strongly here, but I didn't get that coming through as strongly in the book because, you know, and where do these ideas come from, but also what's the importance of them? I think they come typically from policy networks, and the importance is that they usually come because there's some evidence out there that these things can work. So it's important that those ideas and experience and comparative research gets injected into the policymaking progress. But and a couple of your cases show very clearly what Lant talks about, this idea of isomorphic mimicry leading to ridiculous incompatibility between what the externally imported idea is and what the capacity of the system to implement it. But since I've been working recently on a paper on Peru and Ecuador, when I read your cases about the South Africa teacher policy reform of 2007, was proposed but never enacted, and the Cambodia 2014 or 2015 teacher reform, I mean, they're identical designs. You know, it's like raising the standards for teacher entry into teacher training colleges, raising the standards for teacher recruitment, making the profession meritocratic, so with having promotions and pay raises based on evaluated performance rather than seniority and years of service, changing the standards for hiring school directors, making it possible to fire teachers for poor performance. I mean, yeah, and what was interesting to me is if you want to see what the evidence shows actually does raise student learning, it's turning the profession, teaching, into a meritocratic professional profession where people are competent, prepared for the job, selectively recruited into teaching, and then they have enough professional prestige to go to school every day. They have enough professional prestige to exert an influence on their colleagues and so make sure that they're all working together and they come to school every day. And you see in your successful schools, the headmaster somehow manages to create that climate at the school level. But as Rachel was saying, most systems are not producing that because they're stuck in a low-level equilibrium where teaching is low status, low pay, low selectivity, and so nobody in the system feels really professionally motivated to perform or accountable. And because the prestige is so low and the pay is so low, it's hard to get the system to force them to be accountable. And if you can't get fired, at the end of the day, there's limits on what anyone can do to make you accountable. But the interesting thing to me is that in South Africa, this reform was apparently blocked. And in Cambodia, it's, I guess, limping along. It's not clear yet how well it's going to be implemented. But there are countries where it has been implemented. Ecuador did this in 2009 and 2011. Peru did this in 2010 and 2012. Chile has done it. And what you see is major improvements in the quality of schooling and student learning outcomes. Ecuador has improved the equivalent of 100 points on PISA in the last decade. 100 points. Almost 3 years of schooling. And so, we know that can work, but it's hugely politically contentious. In all these countries, there were strikes and violence, and it was a political battle to get these reforms enacted. So, what I would like to see is your framework applied to some success cases too. How is it that the political settlement supported this? And then, because in essence, the reason that reform is so complicated is that it directly imposes costs on teachers. And the teachers union in most countries, and I think we don't give enough acknowledgement of this, it's not just an industrial organization, it's also a political bloc.
Yeah.
A political force. In many countries, a very big political force. And for many politicians, it's much more convenient to build a coalition where you give the union what it wants in exchange for its political support, rather than challenge them with a reform that requires that they give up job stability and accept meritocracy as a basis for their pay. So it's fascinating to me, how do you get that adopted and, even more importantly, implemented? And it would be great to apply your framework to that. As I was thinking about it last night, an analogy kind of came to me, like the settlements framework. The axes, I think, are really brilliant, but it's maybe like the skeleton, and you could say that the system that has, strong institutions and the rule of law is a tall skeleton and will potentially move farther, faster. And then the reformers, the role of individuals could be like the muscle on the skeleton. And the ideas that come from around the world and are supported by research is like the brains. So if you could put it all together in your next book and have like a unified field theory of political economy, I think it would be fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So,
Should we have a first response to those?
yeah, I think so.
I thought I wanted to respond first to some of Rachel's really interesting points, and to say that certainly this question of the kinds of reforms that are observable being more politically palatable and so on, I think is definitely, and in your work with Ben Ross-Schneider, I think this comes out very clearly that policy reforms take time, and I think in several of the cases that we looked at here, where reforms that were likely to enhance the accountability of teachers, the performance of teachers, officials would say, we've just started this. It's going to take some time for this to bed down and flow through the system. I think that's important. But a really important thing I think that we learned, and we do discuss this in the conclusion, but only in the conclusion really, or maybe a little bit in the introduction, is that these are countries that have expanded really fast. These are almost all first-generation learners, and where the schools are performing particularly poorly, it's often in poor, remote areas where people just don't have the resources and so on to pay for the extras. But in addition to which, where the parents have not been to school themselves, or have themselves had really rubbish schooling, don't know what to expect, can't support their kids' learning, can't monitor their kids' learning, and don't, as Rachel said, have the power, the personal power, the social power to challenge teachers and head teachers. So to some extent, and I think we can already see this in Bangladesh, where I'm doing another piece of work with ESID on education on the primary education stipend project, and you're seeing already the second generation, the parents are having a great deal more interest in what goes on in the school, taking a great deal more interest in what teachers are showing up and so on. It is changing. It's definitely changing, and you can feel it in the way teachers talk about their relationships with parents and the way education officials work. So I think there is a first-generation learner dimension to this quality issue, but it's obviously not the whole thing, because some of these are middle-income countries where people have had education in the past. You had so many interesting points. I wanted to talk a little bit about your very important point about the teachers as a block within the political settlement. That's definitely true, and we saw this in some countries where really quite large populations of teachers in the public system do play an important role, also play an important role in some other governance tasks, like in some cases electoral monitoring or public health and so on. And so really quite critical for the state and also for political parties. But I think what's really interesting is that we looked specifically for what teacher unions were doing in these reform processes. And, they're not very noisy in these processes.
Well, but in the South Africa case, they blocked it.
Yes, yeah, that's true, they did. But in all of the others, they're not taking a very active role, and there's a sense in which, to some extent, certain policy reforms remain off the agenda. Yeah. They just don't get near the agenda.
So to me, that means they're being very active.
They're being very powerful.
They're controlling the agenda.
But when we interviewed teacher union leaders in some of these countries, they have nothing to say about this. It's like, well, no, this has never come up. Nobody's asking to be able to fire teachers at the school level for not showing up. So it's not something we have to counter. It was interesting. Their power is such that it doesn't even arise in some places. And this also, I think, is changing in those countries where these isomorphic mimicry type reforms are being proposed. I think that's really important. I think the idea of doing this kind of work on successful cases is really good. I mean, it was a bit disappointing for us when we started that we couldn't detect a huge amount of variation in elite commitment. I think a really key thing here is this business, and Steve Kosak makes this point, I think, very well in his work on the demand from the business classes, and in particular how the demand for skilled labour in global value chains makes a difference. And we think, and Tim can confirm this, that there were some signs of this in Cambodia, and there were also some signs of this really after we finished the research in Bangladesh, coming through from the global export manufacturers, and to some extent also in Ghana. But we didn't see this kind of sense of any demand from business for more skilled labour, probably because there's of the surplus labour situation in most of these countries.
But it's interesting, Ben and I find that even in middle-income countries like Ecuador and Peru, business community doesn't play a strong role in these reform processes.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to consider why that might be and what that will mean, given that in the north they were supposed to have played.
If you were a skilled politician,
could you introduce these ideas into the policy domain? I think is absolutely. Yeah. But thank you, a really useful and generous comments.
Thank you guys. I mean, this is fantastic. Absolutely fantastic.
I might have gone on too much.
Just very briefly, I think exactly that challenge you're applying. We chose these cases on the independent variable side, as good political scientists tend to do. We should probably, what policy wants is to know what works, and therefore we should choose the next set of cases, as you say, on the outcome variable. So that's what we're suggesting here in terms of future rounds. And in terms of reforms and what works well from the literature, there does seem to be, I think, as Rachel pointed out, and your cases that you've worked on with Ben and others, more room for manoeuvre and smart reforms which put together something for teachers and something for learners. So you compensate teachers for the extra time they're going to have to spend training and on task by increased pay or benefits, whilst also pushing hard for reforms which are going to be quite difficult for them to undertake. So yeah, I think the smart ways of going. Chile seems to be a really good example of the way that works. But that's interesting to hear.
When I read your thing, I thought, teacher training is not quality reform. I mean, it's really, to my mind, an accident. It's throwing out money that doesn't threaten any of the status quo interests, and no wonder it doesn't work.
Open the floor.
Cheers. Thank you very much, firstly. It's brilliant. It's super interesting. I want to pick up, maybe because it's slightly touching on this point there about like how, what are you combining potentially that brings together some of those things. But second last slide or whatever it was, you sort of said we need to move away from this idea of sort of politics of reform towards the sort of politics of implementation. I wonder, can you expand a little bit on that? And I link it a little bit to, sorry, I'm pulling up here. So, the reform mongers kind of thinking the room for manoeuvre from Grindel, I think is also that experience of, say, Jaime Faustino in the Philippines, not at all on education, but this kind of, when we're saying getting away from the politics of reform to politics of implementation, are we thinking about the specifics of coalition building? Are we thinking about kind of combination of programming, or are we thinking about, the implementation capacity within ministries or within bodies? Yeah, it'd be interesting to sort of expand on that. Another point, just I'll shut up in a second, but that the point about potentially the sort of support for the politics of access undermining the politics of learning outcomes, and I think quite rightly sort of pointing out the role that donors, either knowingly or without reflection, play in supporting or politics of access when driving at ideally learning outcomes. So is there a kind of a do no harm kind of thing around navigating the politics of access in a way that steers well clear of those potentials for undermining? Slightly tricky, to be sort of pushing more into that politics. But I wonder if there's I was really struck by that kind of potential to undermine, and so then the role of donors in potentially also supporting that.
Do you want to take a few, or you want to?
Take a few, or
Up to you.
You're in charge.
up to you? I think. You reply.
Yeah, I'll take another couple.
Yeah, let's take a couple.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. First of all, I really like, Barbara, your idea of research being the brains of the world.
Very self-serving, right?
Yes.
But so true.
So I'm working at the moment with the DIFID Bangladesh office, and we're coming across an issue in the Ministry of Primary Education in the instance of one individual who is a civil servant but backed by the ministry, who is a kind of negative reform monger in that he is spreading his ideas that are not in line with quality reform. So I'm interested if there are any good examples of where evidence has been used successfully to change the mind or to change the practice of kind of officials in government, has changed those ideas within the political settlement. And also I was interested on the slide before where it's talking about policy recommendations, so interventions to align with settlement type. I'm just interested in your thoughts on how far we should be making sure our interventions are in alignment and how far we should be kind of pushing back against that settlement and trying to change the ideas that are within that.
Yeah. Tuesday, it was good.
Yeah. Another question? Or?
I'm sorry if I missed you discussing this when I was out the room. I'm interested just to kind of hear your views on the sort of multiple manifesto commitments about free secondary education in various African countries at the moment, and whether you think that's kind of reflective of your findings that sort of access politics incentivizes access reforms over quality reforms, and I guess kind of whether you're seeing that play out in those sort of massive political commitments right now. Or, sorry to add like a part B to that, or whether you think that's driven more by external donor pressure related to SDG4, or whether that really is kind of domestic stuff to do with political incentives around access.
I think. Okay, great. Lots of good and important and difficult questions. Let me start with your one. I think I don't know the details of the cases you're discussing, but it would make sense after a period of mass primary expansion for this to move up the system under conditions of political competition. I would have thought this would be very popular in settings where secondary education hasn't been quite so well funded or quite so common or quite so universal, that this would be an effect of moving up the system. And yes, it's very likely to undermine quality efforts in primary education if spending is being diverted there, and I think there are some countries where they're seeing that. I think you'd have to know much more about the specifics of the political competition in those settings, but that's what I would have thought.
Uganda's just one example of that, where I think there is a direct trade-off, and because they moved relatively early towards primary full access, and then had to move logically, as Naomi says, to that. And it's domestic drivers, it's not external drivers. I mean, UPE wasn't an external driver, to be honest.
Yeah,
the
there's a domestic.
was telling Uganda they couldn't afford this, it shouldn't do this. In the first access reforms were politically driven, not externally. Donors came in with the finance once the juggernaut was moving, but they weren't the drivers of it, and I don't think the drivers of this secondary either.
And I think also
the question is whether they can tilt it, whether they can manage to incorporate a focus on quality within that.
Do you think it's infectious?
Yes, I think they do seem to learn from each other.
Probably other places too, announces and other countries.
I think it's internal.
But there was a wave also of this in the 80s and 90s with the fee-free UPE declarations across, I do remember in East Africa in particular. But I think also that secondary schooling in many African countries that I know of is very elite, and very small numbers really still attend, and so there is this inherent drive, isn't there, as large cohorts go through the primary system.
Yeah.
So it's responding, no doubt, to a real demand.
Rwanda might be the interesting one to watch, because Rwanda's basic education is pretty poor, public education. But public education at secondary has historically been really good, so parents will send their kids to private schools, basic education, primary, and then take the kids out and put them into government schools if they score high enough, secondary level. Now, with the expansion of basic education, those schools, secondary schools, are going to come under lots more pressure. Maybe that will be the trigger for Rwanda to start taking quality more seriously. We don't know yet. It's not fully fed through.
Yeah, I think that's something to. Also, the extent to which secondary schooling is private or faith-based, but faith-based institutions rather than public, I think, is important, because the primary system is widely public, and the secondary system in many countries is much less so.
Sometimes it's quite fascinating, because in many countries, probably partly due to the colonial legacy, there is essentially a grammar school there, which are really, really underperforming public. Today, a lot of kids will go to private primary, and then it's the national schools and
in Tanzania as well. So there was also this about your intransigent anti-reformer in Bangladesh. I mean, it's a really interesting case, because I think Sam mentioned this. Bangladesh has moved in the last 10 years from being really quite competitive and fractious politically, where lots of voices had an impact on policy, to really a very centralised, very dominant political system where there will be no political opposition for some time. And I think under those conditions, your intransigent anti-reformer is distinctly empowered to do whatever he or she likes. And I think you do have some challenges there. However, it is also the case. I hope we don't have any specific examples, I think, of where evidence about the impacts on quality have made a difference. But it's in line with becoming more dominant. It's becoming a bit more like Cambodia, perhaps, where technocratic solutions to social and economic problems are becoming more palatable, because nobody's worrying about having to respond to the electorate. So you have, I think, opportunities and challenges in this new political settlement. Yeah, we should talk more about that.
Evidence wasn't important for the big push towards access either. No. It fitted elite ideas and incentives, so you didn't really need evidence. I think it's going to play a more important role here, because it doesn't fit elite ideas and incentives. There's going to be a lot of heavy lifting that's got to be done by getting bureaucrats and other social actors beyond politicians on board with the idea that learning does matter, getting more systematic data on that to prove it matters. One useful but non-state, not very high-level effort is being made by UWEZO, a civil society organisation works in East Africa that compares Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, and that's
not anymore.
Is it stopped?
Well, won't be looking at Tanzania anymore.
No, it's true. Well, it's its own statistics rather than government statistics, but even then, it might be a problem. So I think that type of initiative could be useful.
But I think on this issue of evidence to persuade policymakers, I think this question of whether demand from business elites hasn't mattered yet, or we haven't heard it, we can't see it yet. I think there's definitely in a number of countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, a push to move up value chains, global value chains, and for skills upgrading and so on at a mass level in the population. I think that's the potential area where.
So use the evidence to build these.
I think so, yeah. So to get the business elites on board, and it sounds to me does sound like that's what's happened in Cambodia, and there's a little bit of noise about that in Ghana and Bangladesh as well, more so in Bangladesh since we finished this work, I think. You had a question about implementation, the politics of implementation, which is one of Sam's favourite things. He'll talk about that.
Thanks very much. So yeah, Matt, your points about where we see these. I mean, I think it's where's the next slide? In terms of an ordering between these three different areas of thinking more about the coalitions that can be built in particular different political economy settings is the first issue. Then, which reforms can be supported by these coalitions? What's viable within these? So, what trade-offs can be made? Come to your other question around access versus outcomes. You don't want to see a rolling back of access. No politician is going to buy into annoying a rural base to that extent. It's just going to be too. So you need to keep the next round of reforms around learning outcomes need to offer enough to different categories to build this coalition. It needs to play the access card and the quality card to bring in the right types of actors. And then the mix of that's going to vary. So the mix that we see in Latin American cases vary between contexts. What was offered to teachers and parents in Chile was different to what was offered in Ecuador, for example. I noticed you bring out the role of the president very strongly in Ecuador, more so.
Yeah. But in Chile, you've had very sustained commitment to these ideas for interesting. The parties have alternated. Piñera and Bachelet literally have both been president twice, and there's just a political consensus around this is the way to go.
And a strong social movement, though, strong student movement.
Yeah, that was more about free higher education, which is not related to the.
So I don't think we know enough. We need to do more studies of those countries as to how those coalitions get built and how they relate to particular reform agendas. And then the next research challenge is, okay, well, how do these get implemented effectively all the way through the system? And so we've got a method for doing that, but we haven't applied it because we didn't have the successful examples. So we know which questions to ask. There's a whole ESID working paper that Brian Levy and Michael Walton developed that goes all the way through the system, that builds on the WGR Accountability 2004 framework, but politicises it, looks beyond obvious civil society actors. We found traditional leaders to be really important in some parts of Ghana, for example, to holding local government, holding local educationalists to account. Different actors in Uganda were important. So you can't just read off typical liberal democratic categories. You have to look at other types of politically salient stakeholders. But we do see implementation as not just being a technocratic act. It's heavily politicised at local level. The incentives that bureaucrats have to turn up and deliver. The district supervisors are really important in Ghana, forging a link between district level and school level management. So to try and get away from this idea of isolated heads being the only things that matters. Heads rested heavily on, they knew that the circuit supervisor was going to come round and help them hold teachers to account, and that their promotion chances up through the Ghana Education Service, which sits at the district level, really matter to them. The problem was really that the alignment wasn't there fully, so it didn't work across all districts because the DES is a deconcentrated form of administrative decentralisation. It doesn't really work very well with the devolved form through the political side. So you've got a district assembly which doesn't have to listen to the Ghana Education Service and vice versa, and they control different aspects of the system. So that's the political implementation needs to get a better alignment between those types of systems. You'll still find places where the local configuration of power means they won't work anyway, but at least they should be aligned in the first place. So there's lots to look at around politics of implementation.
If I could just jump in on that, I think you guys say it's so critical. If you want to hold schools accountable for results, it's so critical to have a measure of results at the school level, learning outcomes. And it's not easy for a country that doesn't have any assessment capacity to jump into, an effective, implemented national assessment system. But I think we have to really work on getting those elements in place. What I see in Latin America, every country now has national assessment systems, and in countries like Brazil, you have incredible data about how every single school in the country is performing every 2 years. So, and then all of your discussion can be about learning. All of your discussion about what does the school need, what do the teachers need, what are we doing well, what is that place doing that's working, and other districts look at that and learn from that. All of those dynamics are unleashed if you have the learning data. So what we've been thinking about lately is, what makes countries want to measure learning, because there's the risks of exposing their performance, and particularly in a cross-national test, exposing their relative performance. So that's our next paper.
I think I completely agree about the national assessment systems, and it was for us a sign in Bangladesh that they were beginning to take this seriously. It's very slow, it's very painful, because they found after year 3 or something that learning standards had gone down. I mean, how embarrassing! But they published the report. I imagine they've stopped publishing them now in this new regime. But there are a couple of things there which I think are important. I think the one that was very striking as well, and this really persuaded me that Ghana, there was an element in the Ghanaian national political elite that was serious about quality standards, was its involvement in PISA. TIMSS, yeah.
They're not quite ready.
Exactly. They're not ready for
Although
PISA. But it's very striking to see, they bounce along the bottom of that index all the time, and yet they do it. It's a commitment clearly to seeing how we look in the world, how we rate against others, and I think that's quite, it's a sign of some kind of commitment that Rwanda, instead far from there, rather not know, thank you, if we're not doing well.
No, similarly, in 2015, President Correa in Ecuador proposed joining PISA for Ecuador, and at that point they were, still building this system after their reforms, and there was a lot of resistance within his own cabinet to doing it. But he said, we need the information. But Ecuador is also going to be a fascinating case, because after Correa, there's been a big political reaction to him, and the new administration. And to go to Rachel's point, does the public really value improved learning outcomes? In Ecuador, they've had the equivalent, as I said, of the equivalent of 3 years of academic improvement in the past decade. But there's noises about, repudiating the reforms, even after they've delivered that scale of results, because the current administration wants to distance itself from Korea in every way. So it's going to be fascinating to me if even that level of progress cannot build a public coalition in support of a set of policies that have worked.
I mean, those things are hard to see. Learning reforms are hard to see, aren't they? And yet parents generally have quite a good sense of what's a good school and what's not a good school. And these things, in their view, and sometimes it's superficial stuff.
That parents overstate
the
quality of their schools.
Yeah, they do.
They don't have comparative evidence.
That's right.
So they tend to think it's better than it is. But anyway, it will be interesting to see what happens.
Would it be fair to say that parents maybe don't care so much about the average quality of schooling in the country, but care more about how the quality of schooling of their kids receive compared to the other kids in the country, because they think about schooling as a way to climb the social ladder. So what matters really is that their kid is getting as much as the other kids, much more than the whole country is getting better than the neighboring country, which is more distant for them.
That's probably true. It's policymakers, I think, with the national assessment systems, isn't it? Policymakers, the business classes, political opposition, probably use that. It's interesting that the Ecuador case is interesting. We will have to look at that, I think. Nancy.
Well, I had three observations from a sort of governance angle, and I'll see if I can formulate a question whilst I'm saying this. But one thing that's really struck me is the importance of the local political context for any chance of quality improvements to happen. And I suppose the flip side is that you can't assume that a strong developmental focused leader at national level and a strong political party developmental state push will be able to improve quality. And I think that's quite important for donors like DFID, because it's quite attractive to support countries like Rwanda or Ethiopia that have that sort of situation. And yes, we worry about the human rights side of things as well, but it is attractive. So it's important that you've demonstrated that it doesn't necessarily mean that you get improvements at a quality at a local level. And I suppose the last thing that came out from me is that you've got this really useful framework, but you can't necessarily assume that you can put countries into one of your 4 boxes in the matrix and assume they'll have similar characteristics to all the others. You've still got to do your research right through the whole system to work out what may or may not work within that particular country. I suppose my question is my sort of understanding of that last point is something that you would agree with.
So I have to take that last one first, and I'm not sure if Tim, you're still there, but if you might want to come on this as well. So I think the typology didn't help to very usefully predict the levels of elite commitments you would see. I'm not sure we'd expect it to perform any better in terms of predicting actual learning outcomes, partly just because there's so many other things. I don't think a purely political analysis can ever fully explain learning outcomes. There's so many other things in the mix there. But I do think, we worked with a particular theory of political settlements, a particular typology, which didn't really include a strong level of sociological analysis. Tim Kelsall and colleagues within ESID have been working on this in the last few years, and I've come up with a new typology which will be presented at the conference and in a book later next year, which brings in the social side much more significantly. So you have the configuration of political power still, but you also look at the social foundations of the settlement, which groups have to be taken account of by ruling coalitions, rather than look, as we've done here, at the nature of the bureaucracy. I think that holds much more promise for work in social provisioning altogether, really, and it's a move we should have probably made earlier. And that makes it much clearer that our types of findings actually could be reinterpreted quite clearly through that, in terms of the coalitions that line up behind access and quality could be made much more legible through the new typology of political settlements that Tim's been developed. So I think if we were to undertake Barbara's challenge and write another book about this with new cases where things actually work, I think we would use Tim's new framework as a starting point for that, bearing in mind that it still has to be filtered through the policy domain, which will look different in different contexts, strength of unions, nature of the challenge, and so on. The other aspect which you draw attention to is the local aspects. I think that's really important. I think we have discussed this with DFID country officers as well, in that what works well in some parts of the country or in some types of districts may not work very well in other types. And I think DFID could start to get a bit more nimble about that and start to think about, okay, well, if we want to have quick results, where in the country should we look for? If it's usually very rigorous, it goes with a pro-poor approach. We have to work in the poorest areas. Yeah. With some type of decentralised political economy analysis, you could start to identify districts where there are coalitions, developmental coalitions in place that could be better placed to trial reforms, or places where other alternative configurations of power, where, okay, it's probably never going to work through the state very effectively. That's where you support the NGOs to do the work more coherently, and just to become a bit more nuanced in the ways in which it works at the local level. We found this with our health work as well, which again Tim could refer to, that the local level political settlements really make a big difference to what's feasible reform-wise and what isn't.
Is there any question on the phone? Emo?
No, from me, just to say thanks, Sam. That's a very good summary of the work that we're continuing to do at ESID. I do think that this idea of a social foundation will give us much more leverage over some of these issues.
Are there any other questions? Maybe a last question for you. It is a remark and a question. I'm working a bit now on the education in Senegal, and something that strikes me in Senegal is how important religion is for a lot of people. And historically, the education system in Senegal has been developed by the colonial power, by France, and was totally blind to any religious education in the school system, where like a lot of people value a lot religious education, Quranic education, but also teaching their kids some values like obedience and being a good Muslim. And a lot now, like most of the kids who are out of school in Senegal are in Quranic schooling. And the government has changed its strategy in Senegal to try to incorporate more and more these Quranic schools into the main system. And I'm struck by, because I know very well the literature on education in Senegal, and there are not many papers taking into account the importance of religion in Senegal. And when I'm looking at the work of donors or what the government is saying, I mean, it's not like people are not talking about that, but it seems that there's a big constituency in Senegal, a lot of people who value religions a lot, but donors will talk about, very different things, like numeracy, literacy, etc., where like people really want their kids to learn the Quran and being obedient. So is there like generally, not only in Senegal, but in other countries, are donors and maybe the Western community maybe blind to these issues of religions? Is it something very important that maybe we are overlooking, and we are, maybe pushing for the wrong policy sometimes because of that?
Your Bangladesh experience?
Yeah, we do have some. Yeah, we do. I mean, it's not something we explicitly looked at, but certainly in Bangladesh, part of the driver for the kind of the competitive drivers for expansion early in the day were the desire to, if you like, take up the space that madrasa's Islamic education had taken. Nevertheless, it remains, as in Senegal, it's very, very important. Religious education is very important for Muslims in Bangladesh. And many people will attend both a standard school, nowadays partly because then you also get a stipend, 100 taka a month, but also will attend either a formal or an informal madrasa. But the state system in Bangladesh has funded madrasas to a significant degree. They're kind of second-class public schools. They're less funded, but it's huge. It's huge, and there's been some very good work showing how the expansion of girls' education was in part afforded by this greater space for religious education, funding religious education. So it was kind of made more acceptable for girls to go to school because many of them were going to these madrasas. The other thing is, I'd say you're probably looking at the wrong donors. You probably want to be looking at the Middle Eastern donors who are, I don't know what's published, and I don't know whether it's accessible, but I think that there's a lot of funding for Islamic education, madrasa, school building, various different kinds and traditions of Islamic education as well, coming from different parts of the Muslim world. So I think, it's not in the OECD DAC perhaps, but, there's a lot of it. Whether there's any research, I don't know, I'm afraid.
DFID has opened itself up very much to this, hasn't it? I mean, if you read its educational policy 2018, it said it will work with pretty much any system. I find that somewhat concerning, given accountability issues, and monitoring performance management issues across such a wide range. I mean, we can't really speak from the UK. I mean, we've got a hugely messy educational system here, and I noticed that your policy refresh used that as a useful way into understanding the mess of other countries. It was quite amusing. But I think issues about accountability and performance are going to be really difficult to manage the more splintered education systems get. Maybe it's after the horse has bolted, but I think the more public education can be supported in developing countries where the majority of poor children are, and where the challenge of learning outcomes is at its most pressing, the better. But that's not agreed entirely across the education.
Would you say that these policies, like in this new policy, relative policy in Senegal, can be linked to the power of the religious in the national political coalition? Would you?
I mean, I don't know the Senegal case at all. I'd say in Bangladesh there's been more funding for and more authority for the Madrasa Education Board in the last few years, because there has been a resurgence of the Islamic right. Ironically, as they've squashed and finished the moderate Islamic Party, it's led to a rise of the much further right, and this has created a demand for more space for madrasa, and so the formalization of madrasa education within the system, giving it equivalent weight to the secular system, which it did not have historically. Yes, I think it's something to watch. It's definitely something to watch, I think. Whether it is this kind of generalized backlash against kind of, I don't know, foreign values, this kind of national sovereignty type, or cultural sovereignty, religious sovereignty type agenda, or whether it's something more related to the funding that is coming from Muslim countries that is not really well documented. It's not very well accounted for.
The Islamic Bank of Development was one of the first donors to move on this in Senegal. But there is definitely a concern from some civic society organizations that the religious leaders are getting too much power for this kind of reforms. So there's a balance between how much religious leaders have power in Senegal and the government has power. Some people see it as a battle that the government is losing. Some other people think that the government is now implementing the kind of policies that the people really want. So it's a thin line between them.
Yeah. An interesting area, I think, to pursue.
Yeah. Are there any other questions or concluding remarks? If not, we're going to serve a lunch now. And we serve there.
Let's thank our...
And thank you very much.
Thank you.